Hi, everybody, and welcome back to what should be another big day here in American government. This is our second lecture, and we're going to talk about the Constitution today. So in this set of videos, there'll be a brief history refresher of some of the things you probably learned either in your history classes here or in previous maybe high school American history classes, things like that. One word of caution, though. In the past, students have frequently overestimated their retention of this information and how it applies to political science, so they tend to score lower on this part of the course than they anticipated. So just make sure you're paying attention. Remember, you're responsible for all the information in the videos and in the textbooks. But make sure you're going through this, see how well you do, see how much you remember, really study it hard, because I want to see you all do well on this quiz. Score points now, so then maybe you have some room later. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. We're going to begin all the way back in 1763, a time period known by historians as Days of Yore. You probably remember the story from your U.S. history classes, either in high school or here, but it's worth repeating because the origins of the Revolutionary War absolutely affect how we got from being a British colony to where we are today. So, after the 7 Years' War, Britain was out of money. They were fighting a war in the colonies against the French and a number of Indian tribes, which was very expensive, difficult, and unpleasant for everyone involved. So at this point, the British began to put a number of new restrictions on the American colonists, cracking down and trying to find a way to make America profitable for them. One of the biggest things they did was begin to impose taxes on the colonies, specifically something known as the Stamp Act, where all official documents needed a stamp you had to buy from the British government. This, of course, as you remember, led to the Boston Tea Party. From here, the First Continental Congress was called into session, where they passed resolutions condemning British taxes and administrative decrees. This Congress also wrote a Declaration of American Rights, where they asserted a level of independence from the English crown, but not full independence yet. They also created committees of observation aimed at providing oversight over the British government and what they were doing. These actions ultimately led to the colonists boycotting British imports and providing a base for statewide conventions when colonial assemblies could not meet. After war breaks out in spring of 1775, the colonists called the Second Continental Congress into session. They had no legal authority to conduct war, but they realized coordination would be required. As we spoke about in the first lecture, these are massive problems. Getting 13 colonies together, all the colonists inside, getting them to go in a single direction was going to be tricky, so we had to resolve these coordination problems. In this case, the colonists were going to be fighting against the largest armed force in the world and had virtually nothing to use to fight back. So they had to overcome these coordination problems, get everyone on the same page, basically. The Second Continental Congress instructed the conventions to reconstitute themselves as state governments based on Republican, small r, principles. To this end, most states adopted bicameral legislatures and governorships. They also issued the nation's first bonds and established a national currency so we could begin to borrow money and purchase things on our own. Moving toward revolution, in January of 1776, Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense was published. We'll talk more about the importance of pamphlets when we get to the media lecture, but this was a big deal at the time and was likely to be shared among all the political elites, the leaders, things like that. The basic idea of this pamphlet is that it was common sense to revolt from England and form our own nation rather than trying to reconcile with the British Crown. The famous quote from here was that only in the creation of an independent republic would the people find contentment. Again, we'll talk about this later in the media chapter, but back in Days of Yore, pamphlets were a primary way of communication. They're relatively cheap to print, but they can be reused and passed to multiple friends to read, share with people, so a lot of people can see this stuff very quickly. This began to make the case among the elites to set the seeds for revolution. By June of 1776, Richard Henry Lee called for the creation of a new nation separate from England. So, they began a committee to draft a resolution declaring independence, led by Thomas Jefferson. This declaration was ultimately signed by every member of the Second Continental Congress, and we were at war. In the next video, I will tell you what happens in that war, so be excited.